Hello BookTube, and welcome to another weekly reading vlog. I've been working on two books this week. Sorry, I'm afraid this camera is probably going to show this in mirror image. But I'll read it out for you. The Grammar Book, an ESL-EFL Teacher's Course by Marianne, Celce-Murcia and Diane Larsen-Freeman. And that one for professional development. And then just for general literature, the story of King Arthur and his Knights by Howard Pyle. So I'll start with the story of King Arthur and his Knights by Howard Pyle. I actually finished this book this week. So I had been on page 178 last time, and I managed to read all the way through to page 301. And I'm in the process right now of writing up my written review for the blog, and then once that gets done, then I'll do a video review to supplement. And in the meantime, I'm going back and rereading parts of it, and I've reread up to page 6, so not great on the rereading this week, but I just finished this like a day ago. So yeah, let's talk about this. The second half of the book is divided into what Howard Pyle labels, what does he call it? The Book of Three Worthies, or the Three Books of the Worthies? What is it? Yeah, the Book of Three Worthies. Although it's interesting because throughout this book, Howard Pyle talks about, oh, aren't these great guys, and shouldn't we emulate them, and aren't these such great heroes? And yet they really do a lot of stupid or violent or brutal things throughout, which makes me wonder. I mean, I can understand it makes a good story, but why are we holding these guys up as paragons of virtue? I don't know. But the story of Merlin is part one of the Book of Three Worthies. I should make it clear. This is the second half of the book. The first half of the book is entitled The Book of King Arthur, and is how King Arthur got his crown and how he won his kingdom and how he won Guinevere. And then it goes off. It's called the Book of Three Worthies, Merlin, Peleus, and Diane, although they intersect with each other and they intersect with the story of King Arthur, excuse me. So King Arthur's story is interwoven throughout these. I think the Book of Merlin, where I left that off last week, Merlin had disappeared. He had been vanished by Vivian. And it's implied that he's now gone, ceased to exist, which I think is a little bit different than the previous version I had read, where he had been trapped in the Crystal Cave. Also, as I noted last week, the names seem to be switched around. I think in the Once and Future King, it was Nimue, N-I-M-U-E, if I remember right. Here it's Vivian. But Vivian still has a little bit of good left in her. So before he is disappeared from this existence, Merlin says King Arthur is going to need your help and gets Vivian to promise to do it. And then we go back to the story of King Arthur, and he is tricked by his half-sister Morgan Le Fay into, what is he doing? Goes hunting, and then he's trapped. He and Sir Accolon get lost, and then they go on to a ferry ship, and then he wakes up and he's a prisoner of this other king, who's fighting a war against his brother. Now, this is one of the interesting things about these King Arthur stories, is there's all these hidden kingdoms that nobody knows about that are, in the forest somewhere or something like that. It's very much a fairy tale-esque rules type story. So King Arthur has to fight for this other king. And meanwhile, Sir Accolon is fighting for the king's brother, because they both get captured in different places, I think. And then Morgan Le Fay engineers it so Accolon has Excalibur and almost kills Arthur with that, but then they end up, it all gets resolved. Actually, that story is not so interesting. But it's interesting enough, actually. I should say I enjoyed the second half of this book more than the first half, because the first half kind of had a feeling of a bit of a slog through these uninteresting stories. The second half of the book, as much as it doesn't make any logical sense, and it doesn't make any logical sense, it has a kind of fairy tale charm to it. And so you don't really expect it to make a lot of logical sense, because it just got a feeling of fairy tales. And there's always this mysterious setup where there's something strange and magical going on. And then you're waiting to find out what the resolution to that will be. Even though the resolution is very repetitive, it's almost always two knights jousting with spears against each other. And then one of the spears will break, and then one of the spears will hold. And that seems to be the resolution to every story. Then we have part two, the story of Sir Peleus. So he's with Sir Guinevere, and a messenger comes up from a lady who's in a faraway kingdom, who wants to see how beautiful Sir Guinevere is. And Sir Peleus says, Guinevere is the most beautiful woman in all the world, and I will fight anyone who says differently. Which is just so out of Don Quixote. This is one of the things that was always being parodied in the Don Quixote books, where Don Quixote was always saying that he was always trying to pick fights with people by saying, "My mistress is the most beautiful in all the world. I'll fight anyone who says differently." And that was supposedly in Don Quixote's mind an honorable thing that honorable knights did. And he got that from these type of legends. So there was a knight in the other kingdom that said his mistress was the most beautiful of all. So then Sir Peleus has to travel to that land so he can fight the knight for the honor of their mistresses. On the way, they go through a magic forest. They're always passing through magic forests. And you meet an old woman, and it's a rule of thumb in these stories that whenever you see an old woman, she's never really an old woman. She's always a young and beautiful maiden in disguise. And he helps her across the river, and then sure enough, it turns out she's a young and beautiful maiden in disguise, one of the ladies of the lake, and she gives him a necklace, which makes all other people fall in love with him, or all other people have affection for him. Then he comes and he meets the Red Knight from this other lady, and then they have the jousting competition. Now, there's so many jousting competitions in this book. It's really repetitive. And the characters within the book seem to put great stock in it. They believe that if you win a jousting competition, it means you're the better, stronger, more valorous knight. And if you lose a jousting competition, it means you're not quite as good or as valorous as the other knight. And yet, the way they're described within this book certainly appears to be pure luck. Either your spear will break on the other person's... your spear will break on the other person's shield, or it will hold. And I don't know if there's some sort of technique to this, like you got to angle your spear a certain way or whatever. But if there is, it's not described in this book. So certainly, as far as it's described in this book, it just seems pure luck whose spear will hold and whose spear will break. Which makes all these jousting competitions throughout this book, all these fights where the knights always square off against each other, seem a little bit silly and pointless, but they do it all throughout the book. And they are averse to fighting each other on foot with sword. A couple times it happens, But there's an indication that if you're on foot with sword, then you're really serious and you really want to kill the other guy. Whereas if you're jousting, it's more of a gentleman type thing. Although that seems to be undercut by some of the scenes in this book. For example, Sir Peleus and Sir Gawain get really pissed off at each other later in the book, and they still do the jousting. And after the jousting with Sir Gawain and Sir Peleus, sorry, I'm jumping around chronologically, but that's okay. I've got a limited amount of time in these weekly reading vlogs, so I can't recount every single detail anyways of everything I read this week. So jumping later in the story, Sir Gawain and Sir Peleus have a jousting competition, and Sir Gawain's the iron of his spear pierces Sir Peleus's armor and almost kills him, which puts all the previous jousting that has come before in somewhat of a different light. It's been for sport or for honor or for so many frivolous reasons beforehand. Sometimes the two combatants really want to hurt each other, but sometimes they just want to see who's the better knight. That it doesn't seem like the type of thing that could have fatal consequences, except sometimes somebody will get knocked off their horse, and then they're in really bad shape after they've taken a particularly bad fall off their horse. So it'll say maybe that it looks like they might be dead or something, or there is a potential for fatality being knocked off your horse, which had been introduced in this book earlier. But, I just almost assumed like in the cartoons or something, they were fighting with these jousting sticks that just had the curved end at the end, it were just wood. But I guess this whole time they've been fighting with jousting sticks that have a spear iron tip. I don't know. Yeah, the interesting thing about the last third of this book, where we're talking about the adventures of Sir Peleus and Sir Gawain and Merlin, is that it does have a bit of a fairy tale type intrigue to it. But the thing that's a little bit boring is that just everything just seems to get resolved by jousting, and these knights are just fighting each other for no reason whatsoever. Also, yeah, there's another one. This is in book 3, The Adventures of Sir Gawain, although it concerns King Arthur. King Arthur and one of his pages are going hunting, or going out for adventure, and they get lost in the woods, and it's dark at night, and they don't know where to go, so they come across this castle. There are always castles hidden in the woods, which of course makes no sense logically. I mean, how would you even carry all the stones into the middle of the woods to make those castles with no big roads or anything? But again, in fairy tale logic, fine, it works in a fairy tale logic. So they go into this castle. They're warned not to go, but they come in anyways. And there's this old knight who says to King Arthur, let's play a game. I'm going to try and cut off my head with your sword, and then I'll try and cut off your head with a sword. Now, this has got to be the stupidest game you could possibly imagine. I mean, the guy's got a trick up his sleeve, as you would expect with these fairy tale stories. He's a magician, and even if you cut his head off, it doesn't kill him. But no matter what's going on, and it seems like the stupidest thing to agree to. But of course, King Arthur agrees to it, because these knights, when they're challenged, can never turn down the challenge. It seems to be one of the rules of chivalry. So he cuts off the guy's head, but it turns out the guy's a magician. And so he just puts his head back on. And then the guy is going to cut off King Arthur's head, and he's toying with him. He eventually makes a bond saying, I'll let you live for a year, but you have to tell me what is it that women desire above all else. So then King Arthur has this year's reprieve, but he's got it hanging over his head. And you just think, what? It's your own fault for agreeing to such a stupid game of try and cut the other person's head off. I mean, there's no way a game like that's going to end well. And again, I mentioned this last week, but if these were just presented maybe purely as stories, I wouldn't rankle me so much. But Howard Pyle is presenting these stories as paragons of virtue for young people to follow. Something he makes clear in his introduction and sometimes his commentary through in the narration. So yeah, that is definitely where I part company with this book. Although that and throughout, I mean, I don't have time to talk about it all in this video, but throughout the knights in King Arthur are all doing stupid stuff. Which maybe brings me to another complaint I've had, is you have Sir Peleus on his adventures, Sir Gawain on his adventures, King Arthur on his adventures, and they're all pretty much the same character. They all talk exactly the same. Sir Gawain maybe has a little bit more of a temper on him, although they all can be pretty short-tempered when their honor is challenged, so it's a little bit hard to tell maybe even then. Yeah, that seems to be another flaw in these King Arthur stories, as you have got all these knights of the round table, but they're pretty much just all the same character, or at least they're coming off in that way in this book. To be fair, that was not the case in The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which was the other Arthur book I read. And in that book, Sir Gawain and Lancelot definitely had distinctive personalities, as did a number of the other knights. I'll leave it off there, though, because I'm coming up to the halfway point on this video. I try not to go over 30 minutes. And I want to talk about the other one I've been reading, which is the grammar book. So, again, this is something I had tried to read last year and then got distracted by other things, and I'm picking up again this year. So the first 150 pages or so will be review from what is last year, stuff I read last year. And I read up to page 40 this week. I really like this book, and I would not go as far to say as it's entertaining. It can be boring at times. I've occasionally have my eyes glaze over a little bit or have to reread parts, but it is so clearly explained, and it's such useful stuff for the English teacher, that it gives me a great feeling of satisfaction to read through it, even though you wouldn't really read a grammar book for entertainment per se, but it just describes everything so well. And what you get the impression that it's described very thoroughly. The trade-off, though, is this is a longer book. I mean, how many pages is this? Not counting the appendixes, this is 759 pages. So, this will take me a while to get all the way through, I'm sure. So I get a great feeling of satisfaction by reading it. On the other hand, it's a little bit disappointing. Having read these same pages last year, how much it feels like I'm reading it for the first time again, now that I'm reading it again this year. Because, the thing with a book like this, you want to feel like, okay, it's a little bit boring, it's a little bit of work to get through, but you're going to gain so much knowledge. And it's a little bit disconcerting when you realize that a lot of that knowledge just isn't sticking permanently in the brain. And that's been true of the other grammar books I've read over the years. This isn't the first one. I probably haven't read as many grammar books as I should have, considering how many years I've been teaching English as a second language. But I have read a few of them over the years, if I could remember everything I read, I would have so much knowledge about grammar up in here. But it's just very hard to get it to stick in your permanent memory. I think that's true of reading in general, but perhaps it's especially true of grammar. That being said, let's talk about the parts I read this week. So I finished up chapter 1, which was the introduction, and got into chapter 2, grammatical meta-language. So chapter 2, they're just introducing the terminology for how they talk about grammar. But again, it's very thorough. They divide it into 3 criteria: semantic, structural, and functional. That's their criteria for how to analyze the different parts of speech. So nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs. One thing I thought was interesting here is their discussion about how difficult it is to define parts of speech. So they said a noun is typically described as a person, place, or thing. They said some grammarians add idea. A noun is a person, place, thing, or idea. But really, almost anything can be a noun. Almost any semantic concept can be a noun. So you have to look at other things. For example, the structure, whether it takes a plural S or not, whether it's countable or uncountable, the different suffixes maybe that nouns typically have. But of course, English is often irregular, so you can't rely on that completely either. So you have to look at the place it is in the sentence. Is it the subject of a verb? Is it after a determiner? So those are the 3 criteria they use to define the parts of speech. The semantic, structural, and functional. And then they go through and they talk about nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, determiners, prepositions, conjunctions. And then they get into what they call sentential terminology, which is at the sentence level. So talking about simple, compound, and complex sentences. There was actually a question I had when I read this. They're talking about a difference between a compound sentence and a complex sentence. And a compound sentence, they say, has 2 independent clauses. So he went to the party, but I stayed home. So you have the but in there, but the but is joining 2 different independent clauses. He went to the party, I stayed home. Joined by a but. So they're both independent clauses, so it's a compound sentence. A complex sentence is when you have a main clause and a subordinate clause. And it says, Peggy frequently calls because she wants to stay in touch. And I was thinking, that sounds to me like 2 independent clauses. Like, Peggy frequently calls. That's one independent sentence. She wants to stay in touch. That's another independent sentence. And then they're joined by because, and I would be inclined, just based on that sentence, to use because as a conjunction and not a subordinator. I can think of complex sentences that don't have that ambiguity, something with a that clause. For example, that he is the man that I like. So obviously that clause, that I like, can't stand as its own independent sentence. Even if you take out the that, you would just have the I like, which wouldn't function as a proper sentence in English because like always has to have an object. But that example, I don't know if that, I mean, you could say because she wants to stay in touch doesn't function on its own because you've got the because in front of it. But then by the same logic, the previous example of a compound one, he went to the party, but I stayed home. If you make the but part of the second clause, but I stayed home, then you could say, well, but I stayed home isn't an independent clause either because you've got the but there. Anyways, that was something that confused me a little bit. Then they move on to talk about sentence moods, like declarative, interrogative, imperative, exclamatory, and subjunctive. They say that I think the three main moods are declarative, interrogative, imperative. And then what's the difference there? The two minor moods, exclamatory and subjunctive. And of those, subjunctive is the only one that's realized by verb tenses, like I wish I were going with you, where the other ones are realized by sentence structure. And then they talk about theme, rime, which I won't get into, markedness, and voice. Then they go into talk about supra-sentential terminology. Supra-sentential terminology. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So the level of grammar above the level of the sentence, like backgrounding and foregrounding information, cohesion and register and genre, and then given and new, which corresponds to theme and rime, but is not exactly the same. For reasons I don't completely understand, to be honest. They have a quote from Holiday that puts it this way. It says, "The theme is what I, the speaker, choose to take as my point of departure. The given is what you, the listener, already know about or have access to. Theme plus rime is speaker-orientated, while given plus new is listener-orientated. But both are, of course, speaker-selected. It is the speaker who assigns both structures, mapping one onto the other to give a complete texture to the discourse and thereby relate it to its environment." So it's the same thing, then, essentially, is what he's saying. Theme and rime and given and new. I don't know. I guess I could see maybe where theoretically it's different, but and then chapter 3, which then there are some exercises here at the bottom or the end of chapter 2. Now, what I typically do with these exercises, there are exercises at the end of each chapter, and again, this is my second time going through this book, or at least through the first 150 pages of it or so. Here's my notebook where I've been doing the exercises. I've got a completist personality, so I like to do all the exercises and check my answers in the back, except quite often in this book, the exercises are so open-ended that really there's no point. For example, exercise 1, it says, write an original sentence or short text that illustrates each of the following concepts.